A little later, Jacob Marley sat in a place that Linton had called the Green Room, with a steaming cup of tea cradled in his hands. He had taken to a corner and was jammed up against a wicker basket that smelled vaguely of cats, with his chains piled willy-nilly on top of it. Other ghosts were milling about and chatting. From the snatches of conversation, Marley guessed that this was the sort of production that one was played out often, and with a cast of people who knew the process inside out. Marley marvelled at the tea. Since his demise, he hadn't eaten or drunk anything. He'd never even thought that it was possible to do so, and so this beverage was nothing short of miraculous. Under the gentle ministrations of the cup that cheers, Marley started to relax, and his pounding head began to abate. He realised he'd been abandoned by Linton, this stage manager having quite a lot on her plate. And he started to wonder, perhaps he was doomed to spend the next span of his afterlife in this complex of corridors and stages. Well, he was glad to have the little respite and found that he didn't mind if it did continue. Suddenly he was aware of a commotion that snapped him out of his reverie. In the centre of the room was a Jacobean gentleman, groaning loudly whilst bent over double and clutching at his nethers. Oh, I'm so sorry. Did I catch you in the... Oh dear, said a female ghost hovering next to the victim. Her pure white garments floated and tangled around her. There was rather too much taffeta and silk for one person to wrangle with any expertise. And she was further encumbered by a large selection of bags, 4 or 5 at least, each full to the brim with papers and books. These bags spilled detritus in her wake, and they, well, it seemed to Marley, had the effect of tethering her in the same way as his chains encumbered him. It was as he was taking all this in that spirit caught his eye and used the sudden contact as an excuse to extricate herself from the current situation. Oh, you must excuse me. I've just seen a terribly old friend, she said. Terribly old. Oh, do forgive. Yes. And she started to tumble and snag her way across the room towards Marley. Marley started to rack his brains. I mean, the lady seemed pleasant enough, but he had not the slightest recollection of her face. Was she somebody he knew in life? He thought it unlikely. Perhaps she was a spirit he'd passed in the street. But if that was so, he was sure he would remember those eyes. Her eyes, you see, were extraordinary. They were stark grey of colour and searching in the manner of one either constantly scanning the environment shrewdly or of one with mild myopia. "Darling!" she exclaimed as she swooped down on Marley's presence, startling him and causing him to spill the last of his tea down his waistcoat. "It has been utterly too long, too long. When did we last work together? Now, was it that dank old rectory in Borley? What an utter bind that one was. Oh, tell me, dear one, have you been keeping busy?" Marley didn't have a chance to reply at this point as she swept his chains off the wicker basket. This caused Marley to be pulled violently forward and to fling his now empty teacup into the middle of the room. The shade sat on the hamper next to Marley and, in a stage whisper, which, if anything, was louder than the voice she'd used previously, said, "You'll have to forgive me. I just had to get away from that odious little man. He was making such a fuss about a tiny bump, and I didn't know what to do. And you have such a kind face. And I thought to myself, oh, there is a port in a storm, one who knows what's what and who's who, and who won't see a lady in a spot of bother, not for twopence. I'm right, aren't I?" To be frank, Marley wasn't sure what the shade had just said, so he just gave a general all-purpose nod and hoped for the best. "Oh, you sweet thing," she gushed, "and may I have the pleasure of knowing my gallant's name?" "Marley, ma'am. Jacob Marley," he said. Dear, sweet Jacob Marley, it is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, she said. Now, do tell me, Mr. Marley, do you know who I am? Marley was flummoxed. First, the lady professed to the world that she knew him, yet he thought she didn't, then in private declared it a ruse, and yet, in the very next breath, expected him, Jacob Marley, to know who she was. And not only that, but she had such an air of expectation around her that Marley didn't really want to disappoint her. Would I have seen you at Boodle's? He asked, thinking of the club which wined and dined the great and good of London, and that maybe stood a chance of being the kind of place where he might have happened upon such a lady. This brought about such heavy peals of laughter and intermittent cries of the word Boodles that once again the company of the room all stopped to look in their direction. Madam, please, said Marley, do control yourself. I know, she laughed, but Boodles, really, Boodles. Eventually, she slumped back in a state of hysterical exhaustion, and all was still for a moment. Marley took the respite to try and retrieve the lost teacup, but as he leaned forward, he found the shade, grabbed him by the lapels, and brought him round to stare deeply at him. Look at me, she whispered. Really look at me. Marley looked into those deep grey eyes. Good. Now tell me who I am. Marley racked his brains, but found he could not recall the lady at all. He tried to let her down gently. Madam, he said, you have me confused with some other fellow, for it is with great certainty that I can say I've never laid eyes on you before, either in this life or in my earthly one. Oh, well, she said, it was worth a try, I suppose. I do live, well, not live, but, live, in hope that one day someone will suddenly just say, Esmeralda, oh, my Bessie, or, oh, my darling Nell, out of the blue. Just, say my name, and that'll be it. It'll all come flooding back, and I'll remember everything. But not today, it seems. Oh, you don't know, said Marley. Who I am? No, my sweet, said the shade. But surely you remember your life, asked Marley. I hardly remember last week, she laughed. No, nothing. Not even sure how long I've been dead, even. She laughed when she saw Marley bridle a little. Oh, dear. Still a little precious about the D word, are we? She said. Well, you're going to have to buck up about that. Well, what if I do not wish to buck up about it? Marley said. What then? Well, I'm sure you might be able to stay in a funk about it till doomsday, said the lady. But what good does that do you? The plain and simple fact is we're all dead here. I'm dead, you're dead, every blessed one of us is dead. It's the natural state of being here, and I can see very little point in taking it as a personal slight. Well, how do you know that you yourself are dead, he asked, if you can't remember having been alive in the first place? Oh, well, I must be, said the lady, or I wouldn't be here. Marley didn't think that proved it at all. Yet the lady seemed to think she'd uttered the definitive statement on the matter and moved the conversation onwards. I suppose that's what makes me such a good turn, she said. Never knowing the true me. To inhabit a part, one must lose oneself utterly. And for me, well, I'm often more than a little lost. So, do tell me, who are you? This confirmed to Marley a suspicion that had been growing in him even before the white lady, he could think of no more appropriate name for her, had approached him. Her wits were addled. He decided that the most appropriate way of dealing with this was to humour it gently. I, madam, am Marley, he emphasised the name. Jacob Marley, yes, cut in the white lady. Indeed, Mr. Marley, there is no need to talk to me as one would a dowager aunt of little acumen but great fortune. What I mean to say is, who are you playing in the production? Who are you in the theatrical sense? I am Jacob Marley, madam. In this charade, much like in my very own life, I am to portray the part of myself. I fail to see how I could do otherwise, or indeed how anyone could play the part more truly. This created such excitement in the White Lady that Marley thought she might have a fit of delight. Thrilling, she trilled. Oh, of course, you are quite wrong, but still thrilling. And your first one as well, I'm guessing, yes? My first and only, if I have my way, Marley said. But the White Lady wasn't truly listening to him. She twittered on. And to be given the privilege, the responsibility of being the hook. The hook? Responsibility? Asked Marley. Well, no, up to now I've simply been required to shriek at the old goat. This haunting lark is child's play. It's a wonder that you all think it's such an art. Oh, but this is not a haunting, dear sir, said the lady. She took his hand in hers. This is a redemption. The word hung in the air and the room grew a little quieter at the utterance. This is the most important thing that can ever be done for a soul, she continued, and it is also the hardest. You have been given the key role, sir, for you are to convince your friend to come willingly on this night's journey. If he will not, then he is lost, and so I fear... She trailed off into silence. Am I, Marley completed. Let us not think on that, said the lady, for I'm sure, dear heart, that you will be such a bold and brave spirit that your friend will be compelled by you from the very first. This chilled Marley more than anything that had gone before. Scrooge, he said in a sudden panic. Scrooge? Scrooge will not change. He cannot change. Redemption? For Ebenezer Scrooge? I cannot do it. No man can. One simply cannot become what one is not. Take heart, said the White Lady, attempting to soothe Marley. The point is not to become something different, although that is easy enough, but to remember what we were. All the world's a stage, Mr. Marley. All the men and women merely players. Each of us plays many parts. Yes. And when am I to play my part? Asked Marley. I've been pulled from pillar to post with no clue as to what is required of me. If I were to put my suit before Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge, how long do I have to prepare my case? Is it weeks? Days? Hours? His entreaties diminuendoed at each inquiry as he saw the look in the White Lady's eyes become more and more sympathetic until he was left with nothing but silence. Let me see, she said. I'm sure I have a schedule here. At this, the White Lady dived headlong into her bag. Now then, she muttered, where would you be? Do you know what, dear thing? I absolutely can't ever find anything in these blessed bags. They positively conspire against me at times. It is a rule in my life that if I find one thing that I'm looking for... At this, she paused to flourish an outsized magnifying glass torn from the depths of the bag. The other blessed thing... the rummaging continued, find some way to elude me. She held aloft a stained and crumpled paper. Her pose of victorious triumph was, alas, short-lived. She looked first at the papers, then at her other now empty hand, and then once or twice in quite separate and random directions. This is infuriating, she said. I had my looking glass just here. I know I did. And she plunged once more into the depths of the bags once again. Madam, Marley said with increasing severity at the lady, until once again she popped out of the bag, hair a wild nimbus around her head and falling into her eyes. You've got it, she said, and snatched the magnifier out of Marley's hand. You naughty thing. The White Lady smoothed the paper out and peered at it through the cyclopean glass. According to this, she said, we've had the jump scare at the door, yes, the odd thump and bump, and so now the next bit is... Her finger traced down the crumpled document. Yet Marley felt he already knew what she would find. Bells and Jacob Marley, she said, and looked up at him, one big eye revolving in the lens of her glass. Bells and Jacob Marley, repeated Marley. He could hear the faintest tinkle at the outside of a dusty butler's bell far in the distance. Bells and Jacob Marley, she confirmed. Your big scene. It was at that moment a sepulchral voice that somehow had the quality of gravestones scraping against one another sounded. "This is now your confirmation. Time has come for confrontation. Time to reinvigorate that friendship and rapport. Marley," Linton's voice rang out over the green room. "Make him heed you. Make him listen," the deathly voice continued. "Break a leg, dear," said the White Lady as she harried Marley up and out of his seat. "Make him come of his volition." The faint smell of carrion filled the air. "We haven't got time for you to bugger about, man," Linton said, and stalked off into the corridors, not waiting to see if Marley followed. "For if you don't, condemned you'll be to that which you abhor." A black nothing swooped over Marley as he hurried after Linton. "Only this, and nothing more!" The last two words of this announcement landing like the slam of a charnel house door on Marley's ears and spurring him on in the fashion of a man attempting to outrun a terrible fate. Which, of course, he was.